Hello, my name is Damien. This is the first post in what is ideally a series of videos about literature because I love books. You can see some books behind me. That is not anywhere near the entirety of my collection, but it is what is available within the camera. So there we go. So I've got a few things to talk about right now. Nothing too major. It's more a chance for me to introduce myself to others. I have a few ideas in mind for upcoming videos, but this one is more just getting myself out there. So it is somewhat off the cuff, which means who knows what I'm going to say. Hopefully great things. So in terms of literature, what I'm going to talk about and what I enjoy, my passion is translated fiction, very much so. In my younger days, so in my 20s, I spent a lot of time with American writers in particular, people like Philip Roth, John Updike, Thomas Pynchon, and so forth. And I love them a lot, or I loved them a lot. They resonated with my feelings at the time, which was the feelings of an angry young white man, I guess. And as I've gotten older, I am no longer angry or young. I remain white and a man, but that's about it. So sort of late 20s, early 30s, I became interested in translated fiction quite heavily, particularly Spanish literature. And I think a big, how shall we say this, focus, I suppose, at that time was the works of Roberto Bolaño, who I really deeply fell in love with. He's one of my first great loves in terms of translated fiction, and I'll talk a little bit about him later. But his work encouraged me to explore further into different areas of literature, particularly Spanish literature, of which I really, really admire and deeply appreciate. And then other types of literature as well. So I spent some time wandering around the world of German literature and Romanian literature for a while. French literature has always been a bit of a love for me, I suppose. I was reading French literature way back in my 20s, but I really got back into it again recently, and Russian literature. But then Russian literature is one of those sort of bulwarks of the world literature canon, the Dostoevskys and the Tolstoys and so forth. But that is not what I'm here to talk about right now. Why do I like translations? I think it's easy to say or to assume that for a book to be translated from its original language into English, there must be some kind of quality process put in place. So, for example, there are thousands of trash books published in English every year, because of course there are, just like any other language, and most of them don't end up being translated. So it's easy to say, I think, that a book that's been translated from, say, Spanish into English, therefore has some kind of quality attached to it. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it can be true, but I don't think it has to be true, or must be true, or always is true. But I think it's an easy way to sort of swim within those waters. So, for example, if you were to pick up a random Spanish book or French book or Russian book that's been translated into English, by and large, it's probably going to be, reasonably good. It shouldn't be a train wreck of a book. It might not fit your needs. It might not fit your reading taste. It might not fit your sense of aesthetics, but it shouldn't be a train wreck, which is not always true of English. But that's not really what I like about translation. That's just one thing about it that I suppose makes it easier to not end up wasting your time reading bad books. What I think most appeals to me is a certain sense of, well, I suppose I'm Australian. From my accent, you may have been able to tell that. So I understand what it means to live in Australia. I get it. I've been here for my whole life. So I know what it means to be Australian. I don't need necessarily to learn more about that or to understand more about that. Of course, there's plenty of facets of Australian literature that I don't understand. I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be an immigrant. I don't know what it's like to be an Aboriginal person or a person with a disability or homosexual person, all sorts of different facets of what it means to be an Australian. I just know what it means to be my kind of Australian, which is, as you can see, me. But I do know more or less what it means to be Australian. What I don't understand, or not very well, is what it means to grow up in Guatemala, or what it means to grow up in Paris, or to be a young female in their 20s in Berlin, or whatever. And translated fiction can get there, which is interesting and which is good, and that's quite, I suppose, it's evocative of something that's different to me, and I like that. But that's not the only reason why I like translated literature either. One other aspect of it that I find personally is quite appealing to me is that and this is becoming less true, but it was certainly true in, say, the 90s and the 2000s, I think. English language literature, at least mainstream English language literature, the literature that was held up as, you know, amazing and award-winning and exciting and so forth, was tended to be quite, how to put it, encyclopedic perhaps, or panoramic is maybe a better way of looking at it. So a good example of that might be Jonathan Franzen trying to capture the entirety of what it means to be an American in America. So you have the very high, the very low, everything in between. You've got the rich people, the poor people, you've got the artists, you've got the workers, you've got business owners, you've got women, you've got men, you've got children, you've got grandparents. And that's okay, but I'm not necessarily attracted to the realist concept of literature. I don't need to see something need to read something that can be turned into a movie, whether that's in my mind or actually a movie on the screen. A book that is Bob opened the door, Bob walked inside the room, Bob made coffee, Bob drank coffee, not super interested in that. And when a novel attempts to be panoramic, to talk about the very high and the very low of culture and society, sometimes, not always, but sometimes that tends to mean that things are described in exhaustive detail to capture the entirety of what it means to be alive at that moment in time. It's almost a history, and that's not something that necessarily appeals to me. Literature and translation, or at least a lot of the literature and translation that I have read, tends to be focused a bit more on form, a bit more on style, so the way the book is written, so less so on plot. I'm not a huge fan of plot, and more focused on how the story is being told, because I kind of think that any story at all can be interesting if it's told in an interesting way, which I don't think is a particularly controversial opinion, but here we are. So that is a little bit of an explanation. It's not exhaustive. It's not the greatest thing I've ever said about anything to anyone, but it's a starting point. And ideally, I'm going to explore more of that throughout this channel. I will end soon, but what I would like to talk about at the moment is my reading plan for today. And this is a reading plan that I do every now and again when I become excited about literature, or when I need to become excited about literature, when I'm looking for not something easy, but something comfortable, in the sense of, I know these writers. These writers are 3 writers that I'm about to talk about that really strongly and heavily appeal to me, but they're amazing writers, and that I know I can just sit down and read at, a 6-hour chunk where I can just immerse myself in the worlds that they create. And I do this every now and again as a way to sort of keep in touch with them, keep in contact with them, make sure that, I'm absorbing their work regularly, because that's something I like to do. So I've read all of these writers 20, 30, 40 times, which is great, and I love it. So here we go. So what I'm doing is I'm reading 10 pages of one, 5 pages of another, and 2 pages of another. And at different times, it'll be a different 10 pages for one writer and 10 pages for another. But today, we're going to start with 10 pages of, and make sure I get it on the screen, Roberto Bolaño, Last Evenings on Earth. So this book is a collection of short stories. I'll make sure it's not getting in the way of my head. And it is it is the first book by Roberto Bolaño that I ever read. Anyone remotely interested in literature and translation has no doubt heard of Roberto Bolaño. He was an explosion 10 years ago. Everyone knew about him, everyone talked about him, everyone was interested in him. And what he writes about is the extreme beauty, passion, and uselessness of literature. And not entirely, he talks about other things, but most of his characters are obsessed with literature in one way or another. Most of them are poets, and most of them come to terms with the futility of literature, but they don't give it up. Or if they do give it up, they wish they hadn't. They keep it in their heart, even if they may not write. And the ones that do write, they're not successful, they don't make any money, they don't have any friends. It's all about giving yourself entirely up to something that is useless and beautiful because of that. So this collection really hammers that home. There's a lot of people who come along into one another's life, and they're there for a short time and they make an impact, and then they're never seen from again, or I never saw him again is a very common sentence. And I find that that's quite attractive to me, because people do come and go in your own life, and you might think you'll see them again, but you don't, for various reasons. Maybe they've passed away, maybe they've moved, or they just fade out. So nothing really gets tied up into a neat bow. So this is short stories. I like short stories quite a bit, and I'll talk about them in a different video. But this one here is my 10 pages at the moment. So 10 pages, 5 pages, and 2. So this is my 10 pages. My 5 pages. Make sure everyone can see that. W.G. Sebald, Vertigo. German writer. He's passed away. Roberto Bolaño has also passed away. Sebald died in a car accident, which took him a little bit earlier than probably he expected, certainly, but everybody else as well. I wanted to read Austerlitz for my 5 today, but I cannot find it. It's somewhere within this room of books, and there are thousands of them, which cannot be seen now, but they're there. So Vertigo, like a lot of Sebald's books, it's a wandering through memory, through ruins, through history, through time, and through loss, I suppose. So one of the things that Sebald often writes about is that the ruins of something, or the destruction of something, or the end of something is built into its beginning, and that we are basically caretakers for the end of it. So he's really attracted to towns that have died and decayed, places that have died and decayed, people that have decayed and sometimes died. And quite often his characters will be unwell. They'll be melancholy. They'll be walking. There's a lot of walking here. And the text itself drifts in and out of time and space. Less but so space, but definitely time. So things will go back and forward in time. Seeing something will trigger a memory or a recollection or something the narrator's read or thought about or seen, and then the next thing you know, we're in 17th century Paris or something like that. So this is a very strong book. It's one of those books that if you're not paying attention, you'll sort of blink and realize, oh, you know, I've gone back hundreds of years in time and I'm in a different continent or what have you. So that's sometimes great, most of the time great, but if you're not paying attention, it can be terrible because you get a little bit lost. I don't want to say it's dreamlike in a way that implies the abstractedness of dreams, because that's not true. It's more dreamlike in a sense that things are in flux and move and change, but everything is very rooted in the concreteness of loss, the abyss of memory, and the impossibility of capturing things that have passed. So this is my 5. And then finally we have another Spanish language writer. Oops, make sure you can see his name. There we go. Javier Marías, Your Face Tomorrow. This is a trilogy. This is the first book. I quite like Javier Marías. He reminds me somewhat of Sebald in terms of his preoccupation with memory. He reminds me of Proust for the same reason, but he's quite different in the sense of he's a very masculine writer. His characters are not always, but mostly very male and very comfortable in their maleness. Not the same way that, say, Philip Roth character is very male, which basically means they have sex with lots of things and think about sex all the time. It's more a case of, I suppose, the machismo of the Spanish language. You know, the sense of, I'm not sure the best way to describe it, the overwhelming sense of masculinity, effectively. So it's not misogynistic, although there can be touches of that, but it's certainly very strongly male. Apart from that, though, because that in and of itself would not be particularly interesting, most of his books are preoccupied with translation. So often the narrator will be a translator, sometimes for very high-level government, elected officials, things like that, other times at a university setting. And what that basically means is it allows him to write at length about the problems of communication, the problems of translating. So saying something in one language, you can translate it into another language, but it loses some sense of the meaning. Sometimes it loses its meaning altogether, which is rare, but other times it loses the nuance. So to say "I love you" in English has a certain meaning, a certain sense of what it actually is saying about something, and to say a similar thing in Spanish is a little bit different. It still means the same thing, but it's coming from a different space, and that space is cultural. It's related to hundreds of years of history. It's related to the bedrock foundation of what a language means. That doesn't sound very gripping, and I suppose it isn't. However, what Javier Marías often does is wraps up his thoughts, and his books are often long digressions on whatever he's thinking about. So they're not jam-packed in terms of plot, which is, as I've said, I'm not a huge plot person. But he usually wraps it around a detective story or a death. Often the death of a woman, which is that touch of misogyny that no one really appreciates. But yeah, usually a detective story. So this particular trilogy is a big detective story, or spy story, I suppose, is my understanding. I've read this book once. I've read many of his other books multiple times, but this book once, and for some reason I've never quite managed to get through the second book, which is bigger, and I don't know why. So that is what I will be doing at some stage, because I've got to get through it. And this is my 2 pages. So this one is going to be quite some time before it is finished. So we have Roberto Bolaño at 10, W.G. Sebald at 5, and Javier Marías at 2. And that is me for the time being. I apologise for any sniffling, as I'm a little bit unwell at the moment, but I knew I had to do this because otherwise I was never going to do it. So my next video will likely be on what I've been reading lately, which is these books, but before that, because that is an easy thing to talk about. And then after that, I will start to talk about the different types of literature I like, the writers I admire, and what I'm looking for in a book. So thank you for watching. If you have up to this point, I appreciate it. I recognize that this is long, and I look forward to any comments anyone may have. Thank you. Goodbye.